I am so happy to be here with you today. I've just decided to come on a few minutes early just to make sure that we've got time to find each other. It's not always easy on the Facebook Live to know that everything is working right and perfect, and with time differences and such, just wanted to come on a few minutes early and welcome you all in. As you all come in, please do put a comment in the comment section so that I can see that you're here with me. And we are going to get started in just about a minute's time. It's brilliant that in Canada we have something called the National Bereavement Day, and that is tomorrow, November 17th. It's a Tuesday, and it's just exciting for me that I live in a country that recognizes the importance of us having this conversation. It recognizes the importance of us loving and supporting each other through our grief, particularly in this very difficult year. So it is my hope that together we find a way to walk through the grief journey. And the whole purpose of Healthy Morning Revolution is that we find gentle and easy ways to do this walk. And so, as we gather together here today, we're going to be talking about bereavement and what the word bereavement means, because that's a very powerful word. And it's really important that together we find a way to, um, to explore and to gently explore what bereavement means, what grief is, what mourning is, and that we listen into our inner knowingness around this, and that we learn how to support one another in gentle and loving ways. So, I'm going to start by talking about the definition of the word bereavement. The word bereavement literally means to be torn apart. And I think it's fair to say that in this day and age, in this particular year of 2020, with so much loss and loss of life for sure, there have been so many other losses as well that that we're feeling that loss keenly. We're feeling it in our being, and we are feeling torn apart, whether it is because of the loss of a loved one, or it is because the loss of a lifestyle, or loss of a job, um, or just loss of the norms that we have known before. We are feeling torn apart right now. For those of us who have lost a loved one, be it to COVID or something else, because I think part of what's happening with the grief pandemic that is associated with COVID is that many of us are not recognizing that there's a deeper um, loss that's going on that goes unrecognized because of the focus on COVID. People are losing loved ones, and it has nothing to do with COVID. And somehow that also gets pushed to the side right now. So, what we want to do is make sure on National Bereavement Day, National Bereavement Week in Canada, as we launch into this week, that we recognize all losses. All losses are valid. And when we are torn apart by something, we are grieving. And we need to understand that grief is inevitable when we've lost someone. Whether we choose to honor that grief, whether we choose to be present to it consciously, that's a whole nother conversation. And it's the conversation we're going to have today. So I invite you to get a glass of water, get a cup of tea, settle in so that we can have this conversation, and we can discover what's so important about being present to the grief journey. So, again, as I mentioned before, and for those of you who are just joining now, I want to make sure that you're all hearing the same thing. And please, by all means, I see numbers by a little I there, but I don't know who's with us. So please feel free to write a comment in the comment section and just let me know that you're joining us live for this. And that way you can also communicate with me if you have any questions about anything that I say. So, when we talk about bereavement and we talk about this idea of being torn apart, it's an idea for sure, but it's a reality. In our physical being, we experience being torn apart. We experience all manner of physical symptoms, whether it's aches and pains in our body, it's knees that aren't working the way we expect them to work, it's skin rashes, eating disturbance, sleeping disturbance. We have all manner of physical symptoms. We also have all manner of mental symptoms where we're confused a lot. We have a hard time following a conversation, or whereas we used to read pages and pages at a time, now we're discovering we read a paragraph and we have to reread it 3 or 4 times to really understand what the paragraph is saying. Joe, hi from Ireland. It's so great to have you here. It's so lovely to see you. Thank you for joining us. So what we're talking about is these symptoms that we have that are grief symptoms, right? And we don't necessarily recognize it as grief symptoms because we have an idea of what grief is. We think that grief is to be sad or to be upset or to be angry. We have the notion that if we move through what Kubler-Ross identified as the 5 stages of grief, then we're going to get through the other side. For some of us, we think that grief is kind of a one and done, and when we have the opportunity to have a funeral, that's the moment that grief happens. But grief isn't a one and done. Grief isn't something that happens and then we're over it. Grief is a process. And the more we as a community learn that grief is a process and how to work through that process, the more we'll be able to settle into the process and learn and discover the richness of the process and lessons of the process. So today we're also going to talk about grief and mourning and what the difference is between the two, and how we can work with that. So if you are around someone who is torn apart, who is bereaved, and you're not sure how to support them, let me give you some suggestions here because I think this is a great entry point for the conversation. And then we'll ease into if you are a person who's grieving, how do you work through it? But for many of us, even when we are grieving, there are other people in our world who are grieving as well. So how do we support someone who's bereaved, who is feeling torn apart? It starts by recognizing that you're not going to make it better. We all want to be there to help someone to be better, to feel better. We want to fix it for them. But the problem is, this is not a problem to be solved. Grief is not a problem to be solved. Grief is a process that we need to go through. And so there's no possibility of us fixing it for somebody else, nor is there a possibility of us healing it for them. All that we can do is we can be present to their process. And that's what we're being asked to do. And that's asking a lot. So we always have to check in to make sure that we're actually willing to be present to somebody else's process, right? And none of this can happen on our timelines or our agenda because, again, grief is not a one and done. And so we need to be present and willing to walk with somebody and let them know that we're willing to walk with them. Let them know that we are present for them because that's something that most people who are grieving don't have. They don't have somebody who can actually hold the knowing for them that they know their way through the grief. So if you are the person who is grieving, please know you are the expert on your own grief. Nobody else can tell you what you need to do or how you need to do it or the timeline in which you need to do it, although you may be getting much advice from people. The reality is, even if somebody has had the exact same loss as you've had, that doesn't mean that they've walked in your shoes. Your grief is unique, and your journey through grief is going to be unique. So, the way we support somebody who is grieving is we let them know everything in their own time, that we are there to be present for them and with them in this. Holding and knowing that the person who is grieving is the expert on their grief and that they know the pathway through their grief, that's huge because most of us who are grieving, in the moment that we're grieving, we don't know. We forget, even if we've been taught this stuff. You know, I was the executive director of a hospice, and I've been grieving a lot of losses. And over the last 10 years, I've had now 9 losses very close to me. And so all of the training, everything that you know, goes right out the window when it is your grief, when it is your loss. And so having somebody else who holds that knowing for you when you've forgotten, that is huge. So finding somebody who you know and who you can trust to hold the knowing for you that you are the expert on your grief. That's the starting place, right? Being curious, if we're supporting somebody who is grieving a loss, being curious about where they are in their grief process, not trying to move them through something, but really genuinely being curious about where are you at this moment in time and being willing to be with them in that space that they're in right here, right now, that's everything. So I just want us to take a deep breath and feel into, are we willing to be with somebody who is grieving? And that includes ourselves. Are we willing to be with that part of ourselves that is grieving? Or are we looking to solve a problem? Are we looking for a one and done? Are we reading books so that we can quickly figure out and find out what the pathway through this is? Because that is how we sometimes actually avoid our grief. And it sounds counterintuitive. It sounds wrong that if we're pursuing knowledge, that what we might be doing is avoiding our grief. But the reality is, grief isn't something we can intellectually work our way through because, again, it's not a problem to be solved. And our minds want to solve a problem. Our minds want to fix this. The grief process is a process of reconciling with this loss. So it means that we're going to have to go through the emotions. It means we're going to have to pay attention to the physical symptoms. It means we have to be mindful of our mind that is desperately trying to slow us down. The confusion has purpose. Every symptom of grief has purpose. We just need to learn what those purposes are. And we need to be willing to learn what those purposes are. Allowing ourselves to be present to somebody else's grief or allowing ourselves to be present to our own grief is the kingpin. That's really the key question. Am I willing to be present with this person who is hurting right now? Am I willing to be present to myself with everything that's coming up? If the answer is yes, then you are someone who is like gold. To anybody who is grieving, you are gold to them, right? So being present to their grief is going to bring up stuff for you. It inevitably does. Being present to your own grief brings you deeper into the process. Because what happens with grief happens no matter what. When we have loss, we experience grief. The thing is, do we experience it consciously or not? That becomes a question that is wholly dependent on our willingness. If we're not willing to experience our grief, what we do is we find ways to avoid our grief. We find ways to bury and carry our grief. And when we bury and carry our grief by getting busy, by um, doing distracting things, there's a whole litany of things that buried and carried grief get created from as avoidance techniques. If we're avoiding our grief, we're burying and carrying it. And that will take its toll over time. When we bury and carry our grief, what we will find is that the grief symptoms that are showing up physically, mentally, emotionally, socially, spiritually, those are the 5 levels. If we find ourselves in these symptoms and then we go and we bury and carry our grief because we're not really willing to go there, what ends up happening is now those grief symptoms harden over time. So, an emotional response to grief can be anger, or it can be sadness, or it can be frustration, or it can be overwhelm. If we're not willing to go through those emotions and really bring them to the light and learn the lessons that they have for us, what will happen is those emotions will harden over time. If we're not willing to listen to the shoulder pain, the knee ache, the back ache, whatever it is that's bringing this to our attention, and instead we try and push through something that's a physical symptom of grief, those physical symptoms can harden over time. If we're not willing to deal with the mental symptoms that are showing up, then those symptoms harden over time. The only way to truly go through the grief process is to learn how to convert our grief to mourning, because the definition of grief is the internal constellation of symptoms that are directly related to the loss. So it's the emotions that we're feeling, it's the physical symptoms. Grief is all of this, right? But it's internal. Mourning is the external expression of that loss. And so, if we're having an internal response to the loss and we haven't taken the time and the energy to get curious about it and to start converting that grief to mourning so that we can release it from our body, it gets stuck in our body. And that's buried and carried grief, right? What we're looking to do is we're looking to release it. We're looking to relieve it. We're looking to find a way to ever so gently and in ease and grace shift what's going on the inside and process through it. And our way of processing grief is to convert it to mourning. So, what I'm going to ask you all to do is to think about where you may have some buried and carried grief and ask yourself the question, are you willing? Are you willing to process what's stuck inside of you so that you can have a more joyful experience? National Bereavement Week and National Bereavement Day tomorrow is all about asking ourselves the question, where are we on our grief journey? Recognizing that grief is a process, where are we in the journey right now? Have we buried and carried some grief and we just don't know how to access it? Are we experiencing living a life that is dimmed down and muted out? You see, when we're grieving the loss of someone, there are a couple of ways that we think about it. And because we live in such a grief phobic society, most of society supports us in bearing and carrying our grief. Most of society wants you to be back to your old self. And anyone who's lost someone who is close to them, we know that's an impossibility. We will never be the person that we were before we lost our loved one. That's just a fundamental truth. But here's something that is not a truth, but often is a myth of grief, and that is that I will grieve for the rest of my life. I want to talk about that because I know there are many people in this group as well who firmly believe I will be grieving for the rest of my life. If you're bound and determined to carry that inside of you, then yes, you will hold on to it for the rest of your life. And there are people who go to their grave with buried and carried grief. However, the grief journey was never meant to be for the rest of your life after you lost a loved one. The grief process, the grief journey is about moving through to another possibility of your life, right? And we do that when we identify that to grieve somebody and to mourn their loss is for us to continue in our life's journey. We get stuck in that because we have this myth that if I let go of my grief, I'm letting go of my loved one. And it's all predicated on the notion that we need closure. If I do nothing else in my life but I teach people that closure is a myth, then I will have done well with my life, because when we hear the word closure, for those of us who have lost a loved one, when people are telling us we need to say goodbye, we need closure, something inside of us just caves in because we know it's not true. At the depth of our being, we know that it's not true that we need to seek closure. We know that what we are being invited to do is to find where the relationship is now, and that's a very different conversation. In his book Tuesdays with Maury, Mitch Albom quoted his mentor and teacher, Maury Schwartz, who said, "Death ends a life, not a relationship." Here's the key to it all: death ends a life, not a relationship. Grief is about us working through the loss of the physical presence of a loved one, and we do that as we discover where the relationship sits now. And when we can claim that relationship, when we can find that relationship through converting our grief to mourning, because that's what that journey is all about, when we can find where the relationship is now, then it's easier to let go of the physical connections. Okay? The journey of converting grief to mourning is all about claiming the relationship so that we can claim our love, so that we can claim our memories. Because if our memories are too painful for us to think about, we're not going to go there. And then we are stuck in our grief, and then those symptoms harden. What we're inviting you to do in this bereavement week, what we are inviting you to do in your grief journey is to find your pathway through your grief. Find your pathway to converting your grief to mourning so that you can find where that relationship is now. And when you find where that relationship is now, you reclaim your love, you reclaim your memories, and you reclaim your joy because you're not stuck in those grief symptoms. Those symptoms haven't hardened. So if you're finding yourself in a place where your grief symptoms have hardened and you're not really sure what to do about it, please, 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 I invite you, book a discovery call with me so that we can find out what's going on for you and we can get you back on track with your grief journey, because that's the invitation of this time of bereavement, is to get back on the grief journey so that you're processing through your grief and you find yourself at the other side of it. The other thing that you can do is you can sign up for the Healthy Mourning 2020 program. And I just want to take a minute to talk about that program because that program's about to go through a really big shift because we're coming to the end of the year 2020. So, Healthy Mourning 2020 is about going through my book, and most of you will already know about my book, but for those of you who are new to the group, I just want to make sure that you all see Healthy Mourning, Happy Loving. This is 52 ways to convert your grief to mourning with ease and grace, and it is all about ensuring that you learn how to convert your grief to mourning with ease and grace. Those 52, when I wrote them, I had no idea that what I was doing was I was writing one a week, that there are 52 weeks in a year. That just kind of happened. 52 came forward as I was writing. Now, in 2020, what I wanted to do is I wanted to take a look at what I had done. And every week, we study the next week up, and the next week up, and the next week up. So, Healthy Mourning 2020 is a group of people who are coming together and we are keying into what is the next lesson up. And we're in the final lessons of the year. Um, but the great thing about it is that it was not written as a you start with this and then you move through here. In right and perfect timing, you come in at the right and perfect time of everything. So I invite you, um, if you haven't already, to get the book only because, well, not only because, if you're stuck in your grief journey, there are so many tools in here, and it starts at the back of the book where you can actually find out if I've got a physical symptom, if I've got an emotional symptom, if I've got a spiritual symptom, if I'm early in my grief versus if I'm late in my grief. The back of the book, there's a chart that says, if this is your experience, these are the conversion techniques that you might want to take a look at. So the book in and of itself is a fabulous tool. Healthy Mourning 2020 allows us to explore each one week at a time in our own pace in a one-on-one session where I do a Facebook Live like this once a week on Tuesday mornings. And then we spend the week exploring that particular conversion technique. And you better believe what that does when you consciously choose once a week, I'm going to spend time on this, grief awaits welcome. It doesn't go with time, right? So if you're grieving and you're waiting for a time when your grief won't be there anymore, it's not going to happen because grief awaits the welcome so that you can process it. When your grief knows that once a week there's a dedicated time where you're with a group of loving people who will walk with you through this, who will be of support with you as you go through this, then your grief comes forward easily and gently because it's not having to fight to get your attention anymore. And we find amazing ease and grace week on week as we gently move through this. Okay? If you have catch up mourning, if you're grieving the loss of someone who died 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and you know you've got that hardening of the symptoms, and you're looking for a way to do catch up mourning, because that's what it's called. You've got the hardened symptoms of grief, and now you're wanting to do catch up mourning. The process is the same. The process doesn't change because, again, grief awaits welcome. So the minute you say, I am willing, the minute that you say, I am willing, your grief responds because your grief has been waiting for you to be willing. That's what it's been waiting for. So, Healthy Mourning 2020 is about going through this one at a time. What I've done moving forward in what we're calling the Healthy Mourning Revolution program, because we want to revolutionize the way you think about your grief and mourning, and we want to revolutionize the way the world thinks about their grief and mourning. What we're doing is for 2021, I've reconfigured all of the 52, and I've realized that every month we can go by a theme and we can actually go through the theme. So in January, the theme is going to be physical symptoms of grief. And we're going to go through 4 conversion techniques that are very specifically focused on the physical symptoms of grief, because now we're going to systematize it a little bit. But I wanted to get this started before 2021 because we're coming up on the holidays, and holidays are a challenging time during grief. And I wanted to start with the thematic around the holidays. So, tomorrow at the same time, I'm going to come on again and I'm going to do another Facebook Live that's going to talk a little bit about the holidays and grief and how do you walk through that. What I've done though is I've created a series of 4 for the 4 weeks of December, and we're going to do a special segue between Healthy Morning 2020 and the new version Healthy Morning Revolution. What I'm offering, because I believe so strongly in Bereavement Week and Bereavement Day. When I was the executive director of the Hospice Society of the Columbia Valley, I made sure there was special programming in this week, in the Bereavement Week, because I wanted to make sure that we utilized what the Canadian Hospice Palliative Care Association has set up so that there is a group consciousness around this and that we move through this. And what I wanted to do with Healthy Morning is I wanted to create a special offer. So the special offer is Healthy Morning 2020, which is usually $69 a month, and that's US dollars. I know we've got people, I know we've got Joe from Ireland, Donna, hi, I see you here from Canada. We've got people in the US, we've got people from all around. I want to make sure that you understand I'm talking about US dollars because our platform is Kajabi and Kajabi works out of the US. So even though we're a Canadian based company, the classroom works and the registration works through US dollars. So normally it's $69 a month. That's what it's been this year. That price is about to go up. In January, it's going up to $149 a month because of what we're going to be doing with this specialized program. Um, but if you sign up this week, and this is a special for the Bereavement Week because I really wanted to honor the Bereavement Week, what I'm going to do is I'm going to extend the live launch price that I've offered this past year. The live launch price will no longer be available after this week ever again. But the live launch price is $49 US a month. And so you will be able to sign up for the Healthy Morning Revolution at $49 a month when you sign up for Healthy Morning 2020. And you will immediately be onboarded into the Healthy Morning 2020 program. You will immediately have access to the resources, and I'll be happy to walk you through all of that. It's really easy to do. We are having our next Healthy Morning 2020 Facebook Live tomorrow morning at 9:30 Mountain Time, which is 8:30 Pacific Time, 9:30 Mountain, 10:30 Central, 11:30 Eastern, and it's 4:30 in the afternoon for those of you in England and Ireland, um, and 5:30 for Central Europe, just to make sure that we capture everybody in here. So that's the Healthy Morning 2020 program. And what I invite you to do is join the Healthy Morning 2020 program at the $49 price a month. And then when that price goes up, anyone in Healthy Morning 2020 gets grandfathered into that new program at the $49 a month. So that price does not go up when that price goes up for everybody else. And I just wanted to offer that as part of my recognition of the importance of this work, my recognition of the importance of conscious awareness around bereavement, grief, and mourning, and my extreme gratitude to the Canadian Hospice Palliative Care Association for helping to get the word out and for helping us as a nation in Canada recognize the importance of us bringing conscious conversation to this. I thank you all for sharing this time. I'm going to put the links to Healthy Mourning 2020 on there. If you're wanting to get the book, if you're wanting to book a discovery call with me, um, if you're wanting to sign up for the live launch, and Joe, I know you are signed up for the live launch in January, so yay! Looking forward to spending that time with you. And of course, the live launch is free. If you're interested in doing any of that, then I invite you to please go over to healthymourning.com and you'll see the links for all of that. Much love to all of you. Peace and love to you during this National Bereavement Week. And if there's anything that I can do to support you in your journey, I look forward to it. Much love. Namaste.